The relationship between Old Testament law and New Testament ethics is complex, partly because the law has several functions, and partly because New Testament ethics is not simply construed as a system of rules, of do's and don'ts. Begin with the law. According to the Bible as a whole, the law had to be followed by those under the Mosaic covenant. But the law also had a prophetic function. So, for example, the laws regarding Passover were to be observed. The Passover was to be celebrated year after year, year after year after year. But in terms of fulfillment in the New Covenant, Paul writes to the Corinthians and says, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. In other words, from the New Testament perspective, the Passover to be observed is Christ's death on our behalf, which meant that the wrath of God passed over us and we were spared the judicial punishment that was our due, precisely because Christ died in our place. Now, there was a moral and ethical obligation to obey the sacrificial laws regarding the Passover and celebrate the Passover feast year by year, year by year. Obviously, we don't celebrate it in the same way. To see a one-on-one connection between Old Testament law in this regard and New Testament ethics would be a huge mistake. There is a fulfillment theme that is centered on Christ and his cross work and so on. Then, not only does the law have a prophetic function, it has a teaching function, so that the law itself points out through its teaching function all kinds of distinctions between clean and unclean, between moral and immoral. Be holy, for I am holy. That's taught in the Old Testament and in the New. On the other hand, the Old Testament also proscribes certain kinds of foods. Believers weren't to eat certain kinds of foods, whereas according to Mark's gospel, Jesus said certain things, making all things clean. And so there's no direct mapping of Old Testament law on New Testament ethics conceived as a simple pattern of do's and don'ts. But when you turn to New Testament ethics, you also discover that the way Christians writing the New Testament think about ethics is not simply in a pattern of do's and don'ts. There are do's and don'ts, all kinds of them. We're to love one another. Husbands are to love their wives. We're to honor the king. We're to rob no one. We're to work hard with our own hands, and so on. So there are many, many do's and don'ts. Yet the whole of it, the genius of it, that which holds it all together, is bound up with joyful submission to the lordship of Christ. It's bound up with the power of the Spirit working in us to produce not simply obedience versus disobedience, but to produce the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, and so on, so on, so on. So to think of New Testament ethics as nothing more than structures of conduct that are either approved or prohibited is just too narrow. There are such structures, there are some things approved or prohibited, but there are also there are many passages with an emphasis on the transformation of life that the new birth has brought within us, that the Holy Spirit works out within us as we are increasingly conformed to the likeness of Christ. A lot of ethics is bound up with imitating Christ, with imitating the standards of Christ. Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church. And in all of these sorts of ways, the very essence of New Testament ethics is much richer than simply serving as a kind of receptacle for Old Testament law.